So we are now recording. If any of you don't want to appear on screen, because this will go on to a YouTube channel afterwards, then turn your camera off. And if you want to change your name on your box, then you're welcome to do that too. Otherwise, it's great to have faces to talk to. It feels slightly less weird than simply speaking at a blank screen. And yes, so please use the chat box to post questions. Just to say, this event is part of York Environment Week. It's our first ever York Environment Week, organised by various people involved with York Environment Forum. And I just want to say many thanks to all who've been involved in organising things, particularly Kate Hignett, whose idea it was in the first place, and Tom DeSimone, who's here at the moment, who has been an absolute star in terms of dealing with all the kind of technological stuff, which means that we actually have a website and that kind of stuff, which is essential in the 21st century. So very briefly, the background to this is that when I was younger, I used to buy self-build magazines, and I used to buy the American self-build magazines called Fine Home Building. And American self-build magazines are all about basically how you kind of build a house. They're about how you do a deck, how you frame a roof out, how you waterproof a dormer, all this kind of stuff, brilliant stuff like that. And I used to buy British self-build magazines, and they're all about, what's the most fashionable colour for your bathroom this year, or how do you get a landscape architect to redo your garden and stuff like that. And it really taught me that us British really don't think very much about buildings as a process of building, or indeed what they're made of. And so this idea has kind of roamed around in the background. And with York Environment Week coming up, I thought it'd be interesting just to take a look at what your home is made of and why you should really take a little bit more notice than you maybe do at the moment. So what I'm aiming to do this evening is to say a bit about carbon and energy, to say a bit about how our homes waste energy through ventilation, to say a bit about how they waste energy through the walls and floors, and the impact of what those walls and floors are made of, and to say a bit in each case about what you can do about it and the kind of impact that might have. I'm then going to hand over to Ivana and Tom for them to describe the work they're both doing to make these kind of sorts of improvements doable. During the course of the session, I will refer to a few numbers, but it's basically non-technical. It's basically a layperson's starting point for thinking about how buildings are built and what that means in terms of how we might improve their performance and comfort. So first of all, let me screen share. And hopefully you can all see that. So, this is where I find the thing won't move on. Oh, here we go, right. So as I said, first of all, I'm going to talk a bit about energy rather than carbon. You hear a lot now about carbon zero, reducing carbon, net carbon zero, all this kind of stuff. But I want to talk a bit about energy. And I want to, first of all, to get a bit of a feel for what energy is. So picture on the left there is of an old style electric fire, which those of you older than Hannah will probably remember. 1 bar on that fire uses about 1,000 watts, so 1 kilowatt. So if you run that fire for an hour, that's getting rid of 1 kilowatt hour worth of energy. So if you can imagine sitting in front of the fire, cranking out 1 bar's worth, that's what a kilowatt hour's worth of energy feels like. In terms of what carbon is in there, carbon content of heat depends upon where it comes from in the first place. So carbon content of gas, if you're burning gas, is fairly constant. It's about 227 grams per kilowatt hour. So burn 4 kilowatt hours worth of that, and you've got through a kilogram's worth of carbon. Carbon content of electricity, though, varies a lot. And the picture on the right there is from a phone app called Electricity Map, which shows you the carbon content of electricity in certainly all the European countries and countries elsewhere in the world. And it varies wildly. So in the UK, it varies between about 100 grams per kilowatt hour and 350. At the moment, I checked my phone just for this evening, we're doing about 325 grams per kilowatt hour, which depends upon how windy it is, how much solar there is, stuff like that. Basically, how much of our electricity is coming from gas and coal. And that's what then shoves carbon into it. France, as you'll see on there, is green. They have very low carbon content of their energy because they have lots of hydroelectricity and they have lots of nuclear as well, which we can all decide whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but at the moment, that's a fact. So You can make your own choices to some extent about the carbon content of the energy that you have. So if you're buying electricity, you can think about buying green electricity tariff from a suitable supplier. Now, that's not always as straightforward as it seems, because that depends on how they define themselves being green and how they produce electricity and deal with matters like offsetting. Or you can install renewables, so you can cover your roof in solar panels and stuff like that. So if you do all that kind of stuff, does it really matter how much energy you use, or are you being kind of zero carbon simply by doing all these things? Well, it does still matter. The main reasons it matters is partly because electricity still has to be produced, and we'll always have a finite capacity. Particularly at the moment where we are gradually packing in gas-fired power stations, coal-fired power stations. So the generation capacity of the country is being switched across to more sustainable methods. So it's under stress. And also we're just about to shift all our cars from being petrol driven onto electricity powered. So that's going to have a major impact on the amount of electricity we need as a nation. And simply sticking photovoltaics all over everything comes with a cost too, because there's energy that goes into the production of solar panels, and they've got all sorts of interesting minerals in them, which we don't necessarily want to be using unless we have to. So it's worth thinking about how we use less energy and how we waste less energy in particular. So I'm going to start off by talking about how we lose energy through ventilation in our homes. So first thing to say, which is obvious, is when you warm air up and it leaks out of your home, it takes the heat with it. That's kind of fairly obvious. Our home here, which is fairly airtight, we know that because we tested it, is mechanically ventilated with mechanical ventilation and heat recovery, and we still waste around about 1,600 kilowatt hours each year through a combination of air leakage and air going through the mechanical ventilation system with heat still in it. So that's a fair chunk of stuff. Now, going back to our one-bar electric fire and the carbon that goes into that electricity, that's a lot of kilowatt hours. If your house is leakier than ours, and it probably is, then you're leaking more energy through ventilation, and that's not a good thing. So, specifically, why isn't it good? The first thing is that escaping warm air is replaced by incoming cold air. Warm air rises, cold air sinks, so the air around your feet tends to feel cold. And this is where your body tends to register temperature. So in most cases, if your feet are cold, you're going to feel cold, however warm the rest of the room is. Second thing is, if it's happening quickly enough, you'll get drafts. So again, drafts make you feel disproportionately cold. You may not be that cold, but if you're in a drafty room, you probably feel cold. Worse than all of that, though, is the fact that warm air holds more moisture than cold air. If you go into a sauna, the air feels wet. If you go outside on a cold, crisp day, the air feels really, really dry. That's how moisture vapor works. If you've got warm air escaping through your walls or floors or roof, it cools down, and the moisture within it will condense. So what that means is that you're basically pouring water into your building structure, which is not good. So, is ventilation all bad? Well, no, it's not. We still need it. We need it in order to breathe. We need fresh oxygen in our homes. And we need it to get rid of the moisture that we produce indoors, whether that's through showering or cooking, drying clothes inside, or indeed breathing. But what that means is it needs to be controlled. So starting points for that is thinking about making sure our priority is to remove air from wet places and provide fresh air to places where we spend time breathing. Second thing is to remove it in a way which avoids it dumping water in the building structure. And thirdly, generally, think about controlled ventilation. Okay, so that's wasting energy through ventilation. Now let's think about how we waste energy through the building fabric. So the first question is, what is the building fabric? So I've done a lot of work on this place here. So what I found out about my home and office is that of the external bits of it, 22% of it is floor, 22% of it is roof, 48% of it is wall, and about 7% of it is windows and external doors. Now that will vary completely according to where you are, what kind of house you've got, what shape it is. But it's useful to have a beginnings of a kind of an idea about what the proportions are. All of those are made of materials through which heat will pass. Now, the measure of how quickly heat goes through is a thing called a U value. So I'm not going to go into the details of how that's calculated, but I just want to give some orders of magnitude just so that you know kind of vaguely what the differences are. So U values for typical bits of building, and lower is better. So a single glazed window, U value is about 5, double glazed, somewhere between 1.2 and 4, triple glazed between 0.6 and 1. The cavity wall will be about 1.5, a well-insulated cavity wall about 0.18, timber frame wall stuffed with insulation designed for an energy efficient home down around about 0.1. So there's a variation between the best performing and the worst performing of about 50 times there. So
yeah, well, yeah.
Major variation between the good bits and the bad bits. For
hi Sue, I didn't recognise your voice.
Can I ask whoever's not muted there to mute themselves, please? Otherwise, we're going to get an entire phone conversation. So what I'd like to do now is look at, where are we? So that's looking at U value calculation, that's looking at ground floors. So let's look at ground floors and work out what happens at ground floors. So the first thing to say about ground floors are that they are generally either suspended, which means that there is air underneath them, or they are solid, which means they're built on top of the ground. So how do you check what you've got in various parts of your house? First thing to do is just bounce up and down. If it bounces around a bit, it's probably suspended. If it doesn't, if there's a dull thud and your heels hurt, then it's probably not. Check for air bricks outside. So have a look outside your house, down at near ground level. If there are air bricks there, it's probably suspended. Although having said that, at some point along the path of history, it might have been replaced and a solid floor put in. If it's suspended and built before the 1960s or thereabouts, then what that means is, as you've got in this picture here, you will have timber joists spanning across the room, carrying floorboards or sheet flooring like chipboard or something like that. Fresh air is deliberately encouraged into the space under that floor, because what you want to try and do is make sure that despite the ground being damp underneath it, the joists and the timber floorboards stay dry. So that fresh air ensures the floor is cold in winter, and it ensures there are lots of drafts if you have a gap between the floorboards or underneath the skirting or stuff like that. It's doing a useful job, but that comes at a price. So the implications of that, the good news in that is that there's lots of space underneath there to introduce insulation, and you can probably prevent drafts by sealing those gaps in the floor decking. The bad news, though, is that you'll probably need to take up the whole of the floor in order to get insulation in there in the first place. Second type of floor we talked about there is a solid floor. So here we've got a solid floor of concrete being poured there. For example, if you've got a Victorian house, your kitchen and the hallway are probably going to be solid floors made out of concrete straight onto the ground. In a more recent house, there may be a layer of insulation in there, but there may not. So again, that comes with bad news and good news. So let's do the bad news first. So the first thing about that is there's no way of getting insulation in there without removing the entire slab, digging down to create the space to put insulation beneath it and then replacing the slab, or by putting insulation on top of the floor slab, which then raises the floor level and means you have to cope with that wherever that causes issues. The good news, well, there isn't really any other good news other than the fact that probably, taking a Victorian house as an example, if your hallway floor is probably less than 5% of the overall building fabric, unless you're going to spend an awful lot of time out living in your hallway, it's probably not going to kill you with cold. So it's a relatively minor issue, but that's about as good as the news gets on that one. So let's shift on from talking about floors to talk about what your external walls might be made of. So in the UK, external walls are generally one of two sorts. They're either solid or they're cavity. So how do you tell? If there's brick on the outside and you can see the brickwork, then the first thing to do is to see, is it all stretchers? Is it all long bricks long side onwards? Because if it is, it's probably a cavity wall. As soon as you start to see headers, the short bits on there, so the end of a brick, then that means the bricks must be going the other way as well, which means it's probably a solid wall. So what's the difference between them in terms of what they then do? So the first thing to say is if it's a solid wall, it's acting rather like an overcoat. bricks and the mortar are slightly porous. They'll get wet on the outside when it rains, but they'll then dry out in between times, so that they're generally, although the moisture will get into the wall to some extent, it won't get right the way through and come out on the inside. Moisture will also get into that wall from the inside too. As we've discussed, we've said moisture vapor finds its way out through the wall and will condense when it gets cold enough. Bricks are not particularly good insulators. The best you can say about them is they store heat, and hence if you get them warm in daytime, they'll take a while to cool down. So what can we do about that? Well, one way we can deal with it is we can insulate the wall on the outside. So here's an example where someone's taken a brick built, solid brick wall house, which in this case has already got render on the outside, but it doesn't matter. And they've insulated it externally and put more render on the outside of that. So the advantages of insulating on the outside of the wall is that it keeps the brickwork warm. So it means if any moisture does find its way into the brickwork, at least there's less likelihood of the moisture condensing into the brickwork itself. The disadvantages are it changes the external appearance of the house. So if you've got a brick built house and a street of brick built houses, you may not want your house to be the one that looks different. It can conflict with detailing at the roof. So if the roof doesn't stick out very far, if the eaves are shallow, then it's difficult to deal with when you get to the top of the wall. You might have to rebuild part of the roof. And also, once you've got the insulation on the outside, you need to then put a finish on the outside of that so it looks okay and so it's kept dry. The alternative is we can insulate on the inside. There are various ways of doing that. Now, the advantages of that are that you could do one room at a time. You can do it piecemeal. You could start in a room as you decorate it, improve the insulation on the inside, just do that one, and know at least you're doing stuff towards a complete job if you do the whole house eventually. Very different to doing it externally then. You can use all sorts of different types of insulation on the inside, because it can be, as shown here, a mineral wool insulation, which is squishy, because you can then put plasterboard on the inside of that. And it means that the external appearance of your house stays the same. The disadvantages to that, though, are that firstly, you lose space internally. If you didn't know what size the room was in the first place, it wouldn't worry you. But the fact that you've got used to it being, X by X means that once it gets a little bit smaller, you tend to notice. You lose any detailing you've got there generally. So if you've cornices or dado rails or skirtings or stuff like that, all of that gets covered up and has to be redone. The other issue with doing insulation internally is you need to think about how you stop moisture getting into the walls and what happens if it does. So you need to provide an air tightness layer on the inside to make sure that you're really sealing the moisture into the space and not letting it into the wall, not letting it into the edges of the floors. If it's a cavity wall, so here's a very, very, very simple cavity wall, then generally, the inner leaf of the wall will be lighter weight and made out of blockwork. It's shown as brick here, but it normally be blockwork. The inner leaf may be timber frame. It's difficult to work out what it is without often poking a few holes and taking a look into it. Here, the wall relies on the cavity to prevent moisture moving inwards, which is why filling the cavity by insulating the cavity can be a very risky business, because you're then bridging across between this potentially wet outer leaf and what you want to be a very dry inner leaf. Another reason for not insulating cavities is that they're generally not very wide. If you've only got a 50mm cavity, you're only ever going to get 50mm of insulation there. It doesn't give you really that much benefit. So generally, even if you've got cavity walls, it's probably worth treating them as if they're solid walls from the point of view of insulating and the measures you need to take when you insulate.
Yes, she is.
So how much difference can all of that make? I've got an example here, which is a little bungalow, a semi-detached bungalow, which I took a look at for a client a year or so back. This is a little chart which shows where all the energy is going there. So the left-hand bar on that chart shows you where the energy is going. So if you look at the green bit at the bottom is ventilation, the yellow is the windows, the brown is the floor slab, the dark blue is the roof, and the pale blue are the external walls. So that shows you what the split there is between where energy is clearing off out through various means. And on the right hand side, the bar there, the yellow bits at the top show the solar heat gains into it, so heat coming through the windows. The orange is heat coming from incidental stuff inside, so cooking and eating and showering and stuff like that. And then the red is the proportion that has to be put into the house by heating. And as you see, it's a very, very large proportion. This is not a house that's going to be comfortable if the heating goes down. So that was why the clients wanted to start looking at what we could do to it. So what I did was to look at a variety of measures on this, and this is the kind of typical mix that you might do to a house if you were to try and kind of make major improvements. So the first, this chart here shows two loads of figures. The peak heat load is basically the worst case amount of heat you're going to have to fire into the house on a cold winter's day. So what this is saying is the starting point is you need about 5,000 odd watts, so 5.5 kilowatts to keep this house warm in winter time. The column on the right is the annual energy use. That's how many kilowatt hours, total amount of energy that gets used in the course of a year. So starting points at the top. First thing we looked at doing was insulating all of the timber floors. So taking all the timber floors up, insulating between the joists, putting the floors down, and probably putting sheet flooring down instead of floorboards down, and then using that as an opportunity to keep some of the drafts out too. So as you can see straight away, that kind of lobs about kind of 400, 500 watts off the peak load and a lot off the annual energy use. The next thing we looked at was improving air tightness. Because the house was kind of reasonably old, windows were poorly fitting, stuff like that. There was fairly straightforward stuff you could do simply by going around and looking at how you filled in those gaps, sorted out the leaks. And again, that has a kind of fairly significant impact on both the peak load and the annual energy use. The next thing we looked at on this one, which is kind of a slightly drastic option, but it was worth having a look at here, was installing mechanical ventilation on the basis that once you start to bring the leakiness of the house down to the point where it's reasonably airtight, putting in controlled ventilation where you know you've got proper ventilation, but also you know you're not throwing away stacks of heat makes sense. And then the last thing I've got on this chart was the idea of looking at installing external wall insulation. So putting 75 mil of polystyrene insulation on the outside of all the walls in order to wrap the whole of the house around the outside. The roof insulation wasn't bad already, and we've looked at doing the floors here. So there's a set of measures there which kind of addresses most of the bits of the house which are performing badly. So if I then go on through here.
Phil?
Yep.
Phil, just a thought before you move on. Do you want to make me co-host or host? And then I can sort of mute whoever it is that unfortunately keeps coming up.
I'm just about, well, I'm fairly close to finishing, so I think I might have to
Okay.
put up with the grunts and so on. I think if I make you host, then I won't be able to continue.
Right. Yeah,
Yep.
fair enough.
Yeah.
Never mind. But if you could maybe maximize your screen, that would help.
Okay, hold on one moment. Right. Right, so the combination of the stuff listed above. So the benefits of doing what's shown there are, firstly, simple reduction in heat loss, so that makes the house more comfortable, reduces the energy bills, reduces the amount of energy used. Secondly, warmer floors mean warmer feet. So one of the reasons for doing the ripping the floors up, putting insulation into the floor and putting them back down again is that we could install underfloor heating at the same time, probably. Another benefit of installing mechanical ventilation heat recovery is that in addition to getting the energy improvements, you get filters on the ventilation air, so you're getting cleaner air coming into the building. This was in a place where external air quality wasn't brilliant. It means that in a house where you're not necessarily using the whole of the house all the time, where you have a spare bedroom that tends to kind of end up being shut most of the time and not used, you get fresh air in all the rooms all the time. So you don't get mold growth in kind of quiet corners of rooms that are being underused and stuff like that. And it also means that in bathrooms where you'd normally have a noisy extract fan kicking off as soon as you fling the door open and turn the light on, you don't, because you've got background ventilation for the whole of the house. So there's a whole kind of raft of advantages there, which are alongside just the straightforward energy reduction. So just to summarize them, from what I've said, I think that it hopefully is clear that a basic understanding is useful. So just having some idea about the orders of magnitude makes it possible to spot the main places where you're wasting energy, and therefore to think about what the first kind of culprits are when you start to think about making change. So broad understanding is useful, detailed understanding is better, but just a broad understanding is at least a useful starting point. Second thing is that we need ventilation, both for the health of ourselves and also for the health of the building structure, but it needs to be controlled. Thirdly, reducing energy wastage by improving insulation isn't often straightforward. If this was all very easy, then we'd all have done it already. Also, I'd be sitting here saying, just get out and get on and do it. Don't listen to me anymore. But it's not. It's not straightforward. But it can make a big difference, both in terms of energy use and energy wastage, and also in terms of comfort. But, and there's a big but, we need to think about what happens to moisture as it finds its way outwards through any building structure. And that once you start insulating buildings, then that becomes ever more the case. It's very easy to create problems in buildings by slapping insulation in the wrong place and not thinking about where moisture goes. It's worth also bearing in mind that as we insulate, at the same time as that, we can reduce air leakage by sorting out unwanted gaps. And again, but this comes with a big but, which is, my last slide has disappeared. Oh, there we go. Which is that when we insulate, we need to ventilate. So bringing the air tightness of a house up will save money, avoid wasting energy through ventilation, but we do need to ventilate buildings properly at the same time once we start doing that to them. So at this point, I shall stop sharing. What I would like to do is to hand straight on to Ivana to talk a bit about, oh, she is looking worried there, to talk a bit about how the work that she's doing for us at Nix contributes to this process of thinking about how we might improve the performance of our buildings.
Okay, thank you. Presume you've allowed me to share. So
I hope so.
Okay. Thank you. I think I thought we would do questions first, but I guess it makes sense in some way. Get the talking out of the way,
This
and then
gives
we
me a
have time
chance
for
to have a look through the
questions.
chat box, so I'll do that.
Yes, of course. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm Ivana, and I'm from St. Nick's, which is a charity that has transformed a former rubbish tip into a 24-acre nature green haven and environment centre, just 1 mile from the city centre. If you haven't been, I do recommend that you go for a visit, because it is amazing what nature can do, how it can recover with some help. We have recorded over 1,000 species so far in a variety of habitats on top of what used to be a rubbish tip. So it is amazing. However, tonight we're looking at the urgent needs to reduce carbon emissions and improve lives. So I'll share a bit about what St. Nick's is doing on that. The Environment Centre was a pioneering design when it opened in 2000. The aim for it was to be a carbon neutral showcase of sustainability. Our energy needs were meant to be covered with a wind turbine and solar panels, with surplus sent into the grid and shortfalls covered by a 100% renewable energy supplier. A lot of attention was paid to waste, water, and use of materials to make the building as eco and self-contained as possible. Of course, the reality has been somewhat mixed, as a lot of pioneers discover. At best, we've produced a quarter of the energy that we needed to power the building, but we do use Good Energy, who are one of the few truly 100% renewable suppliers in the UK. Not all of the building design features stand up to today's scrutiny, and some, let's say, certain inefficiencies are built into it. I won't go into detail of it now, though. I'm very happy to answer questions if anyone's interested, because it is an interesting sort of case study of its own. Suffice to say, 20 years on, there's a lot to update and improve, and to make the centre a showcase building again. And in my relatively new role as St. Nick's Sustainability Officer, it's now my job to do it and sort of make this a showcase again. So watch the space, but maybe don't you hold your breath, because there's quite a lot to do. In the meantime, we are very keen to showcase good examples of buildings that reduce carbon emissions lower bills, and increase comfort. I believe that peer learning and actually visiting eco buildings is a powerful way to encourage people, especially those who may not necessarily be thinking about the environment first and who just want a comfy home, which is something that we should all be able to enjoy. So we came up with the idea of, well, no, we didn't come up with the idea, but we started the concept of York Open Eco Homes, and inspired very much but by other events around the country. In the first year, in 2015, it actually happened to be one of the biggest events of its kind in the country, with around 300 visitors to several local homes. And we were, rather pleased with that result. This picture is from this year, though, when we were forced to go online. But it meant we could have held 2 events that way, and you may recognize Phil's house in the top right corner, because one of his house featured. And you can catch up with both events online if you'd like to on our YouTube channel. So over the years, we've helped open doors to new houses because we really need the building industry to improve its track record. And for that to happen, there needs to be a demand for better. As it happens, all those new houses were designed by Phil using Passive House standard. But it is the most rigorous standard when it comes to designing for energy efficiency and thermal comfort. I remember hearing one of the happy Passive House owners saying that their house oozes well-being. And I thought that was a great testimonial to this approach. I'd love to have a house that oozes well-being. Don't know about you. There are other standards to use to aim for, such as the one promoted by Association for Environment Conscious Building. But the main thing really is to go beyond current building regulations, which are frankly just not good enough in many respects. But we are even more keen to showcase retrofit, because the vast majority of houses that we'll be living in 2030 or 2050, by which point the city and the country should be zero carbon, they're already standing. There's a lot. There's 27 million houses or something like that in need of retrofit. So we've had homeowners sharing their experiences with implementing some large-scale measures. For an example, this is Lilac House down by the U's, whose owners had to combine energy efficiency such as insulation or air source heat pump with floodproofing. They've been flooded twice within a few years, so their long-term plan for the house had to incorporate the river into it. And I think it's a really interesting case study in how to do that and still make a home that's, uses as little energy as possible, generates what they can. There are also plenty of small things that can make a fairly big difference, such as draft proofing. In this picture, you may recognize a chimney sheep, which can be used to seasonally block off unused chimneys, which can contribute quite a large amount of drafts in a home. And all of those measures together add up. But as Phil mentioned, they can also potentially create some new problems and challenges. So sharing experiences and skills is extremely valuable. And this is Tom. He's a friend, the one with a cup of tea, and he's a climate scientist, and he's very keen to actually live by his science, not just talk about it. So he's been sharing his experiences of retrofitting 2 homes now on his blog, which I will share a link for later. Of course, it's even better to talk over a cup of tea. So hopefully next year we'll be able to do that again, and we'll be able to have open eco homes as we know them. In the meantime, we can help you on your home improvement journey by sharing what we've learned through our case studies, which are featured on the website, and I hope to be adding some more soon. And would love to feature yours if you have one. So would love to hear from you. We might also be able to put you in touch with particular homeowners who are happy to share their sort of experiences outside of these events. So if you're interested in a particular case study, get in touch and we might be able to connect you to them. We can also lend you a thermal leak detector. So that's one of those gadgets up in the picture, which can sort of show you cold spots and help you identify drafts around the house. Although we are somewhat trumped by Your Community Energy's thermal imaging camera, which is even better. But, we've got a few of those and they only have one. So it's a useful tool. I also send out monthly updates on zero carbon issues, specifically sort of sharing tips on saving energy and retrofitting and related climate issues. So you might like to sign up to that. And if I may just continue with a couple more plugs, then looking beyond buildings and how we use them, at what we also fill them with, our new exciting precious plastic project has launched to help rethink waste, because of course I think around half of the UK's footprint, if you look at it, if you look at the emissions that we effectively outsource from countries that make most of the stuff that we use and include manufacturing and building, then around half of our footprint is stuff. So reducing it in the first place is a really good way to reduce carbon emissions. And this project, put simply, will be using open source machinery to locally recycle plastic, reduce its climate as well as other impacts, and promote circular economy in a fun and creative way, or in fun and creative ways. So if you can, please support it. We've hit our first £5,000 target, but could do with even more money. And you can find out more about it on the website, or join me this Thursday for another York Opening York Environment Week event, which will be a waste-free lunch challenge. So we'll be attempting to have lunch without waste. And to finish off, finally, looking at the bigger picture, of course, we can all be doing, and I'm sure most of us are doing, lots of small or big bits in our homes and workplaces, but I think we can make an even bigger difference together. Making York and the country zero carbon in time to prevent a catastrophic climate change needs every single one of us, not just the government or council, to act. So how do we get there, especially whilst we are still grappling with the pandemic and other issues? One answer is joining forces. So I'd like to invite you to get talking and taking action with us. The idea is to have a monthly, for now online, session for people and organizations of York and beyond, to share their plans, get inspired by others, and just as importantly, to pledge further action. It will be a space to be positive, creative, and collaborative. So talking about solutions rather than dissecting problems. It's a collaboration between St. and 2 other organizations, but we're very keen to see others joining us in. So I hope to see you maybe there, or on Thursday, or some other occasion. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Interesting stuff there, and a wonderful unashamed plug for your upcoming gig as well. So hopefully we'll get people signed up for that. So that's excellent. Tom, would you like to say a few words about York Community Energy?
Yes, please. So I'll just share my screen. Okay, so yes, so I'm from York Community Energy, and so if you don't know, we are an independent volunteer-run charitable organisation, although we're kind of in the process to transitioning into a community benefit society at the moment. We were established in 2015, and York Community was set up to bring community-owned renewable energy generation to York. So basically solar panels and wind turbines and things like that are owned by the people of York. And we've kind of expanded our remit a bit as well now. So we're looking at insulation and the kind of thing that Phil's been talking about. So basically retrofitting homes, and how can we help the people of York retrofit their homes. So for that purpose, we started what we're calling the Warmer Homes York project. And you might spot Ivana in there as well. Ivana does wear many hats, and t-shirts, and she does have York Community hat and t-shirt. Yes, and Ivana's been very instrumental in this as well. But basically what we've been doing is we've been sort of going around people's houses and doing assessments. And actually there's another person on the call who's in this photo, Andy Walker, from Shore Insulation. And we've been shadowing him doing some assessments. This was, before COVID. So going around and sort of going room by room and telling people how they can improve the insulation in their house. And we've also done some housewarming parties, which is what this is all about down here, where you get a bunch of volunteers together, go around to someone's house, and you do a bit of DIY insulation together. Again, under the care of an expert, who in this case again was Andy Walker. But yes, so here we were insulating underneath a suspended timber floor and putting some, basically taking up the floorboards and kind of stuffing a load of mineral wool underneath. So the idea there is that you gain the skills together, and you can sort of take them on and sort of maybe do them in other people's houses as well. So that's kind of where we started from. More recently, we, like Ivana mentioned, we've acquired a thermal imaging camera, which is quite a fun piece of kit. And we've been going around people's houses and sort of just finding sources of thermal leaks in the houses. So we've got an example here. This is a particularly awful example where somebody had a loft extension done, and basically they just didn't put any insulation back afterwards. And the homeowner came to us saying that they were finding spots of mold on the ceiling in the bedroom, and that's why it's just absolutely freezing there basically and causing condensation. Another thing we've been doing as well is draft proofing workshops. So we've heard a bit about draft proofing already from Ivana. So this was before COVID, before the lockdown. We got a bunch of people together, and we were actually trained up by someone from Carbon Co-op, this lady here, Anika, and she kind of taught us how to do a draft proofing workshop basically, and then unleashed us on the unsuspecting public later that afternoon. It went surprisingly well, actually. So well, in fact, that we've done it again since. We've done it online just a couple of weeks ago. And we've been doing some other talks as well. Obviously, we've moved a lot of our stuff online because of COVID. So we've been doing talks about building back better with a green recovery from the pandemic. And that was all about how we can, use government stimulus to basically fund a green recovery through sort of home insulation and that kind of stuff. And that was actually before the Green Homes Grant was announced, which you might have heard of, which is basically a sort of £5,000 voucher scheme to make improvements to your house, to make it either better insulated or to use renewable heating like heat pumps and things. So we've actually done a talk about that online as well, and just sort of telling people, what's included and how to get the most benefit out of it, things like that. And all this stuff we've kind of brought together in our sort of Warmer Homes York section of our website. Yes, you can find all that stuff on there. As for the future, as I say, we are in the process of transitioning to a community benefit society, and we're hoping what that means is that we're going to be able to do a lot more stuff ourselves, sort of like services that we deliver directly. As I say, in the past, we've done a lot of stuff sort of shadowing Andy Walker, for example, and we're sort of wanting to offer some of these services ourselves. The thermal imaging surveys, we definitely want to do more of. They were very popular in the past, pre-COVID. And yeah, as soon as we can do them safely again and within restrictions, then we will do. Similarly, more housewarming parties, they're really popular. But the main thing is that we want to be doing our own home assessments, and we've got a growing list of people wanting home assessments. And we're sort of having a bit of trouble getting through them at the moment because we're in this kind of transition period. So we're hoping to get on top of that and sort of get our own service rolled out quite soon. And in addition to that, we've been talking to various organisations as well. So we're hoping to do something with the council at some point in the future. And also we've been talking to St. Nick's about doing some projects together. So there's lots of exciting things in the pipeline. But yeah, I guess the main thing is if you live in York and you're interested in doing some of the stuff you've heard about tonight on your own home, retrofitting some insulation or doing some draft proofing and stuff like that, if you want to know more about the Green Homes Grant, then send us an email. We'd love to hear from you. And then I've got a couple of events to plug myself. So York Environment Week is really great and chock full of events. So we've got a couple of things going on. So on Thursday this week, we've got a talk about the grid, the electricity grid, and kind of how it started and where it's headed, basically. because there's some interesting challenges now. We're going to be putting a lot more renewable energy on the grid, and how we kind of deal with that and balance it and things. And then on Friday, we've got a replay of the draft proofing workshop that we did online. So it's basically just going to be a recording of the Zoom session that we did. It's going to be on YouTube, and it's going to be premiering on YouTube on Friday. So it's got very exclusive, and there'll be a sort of live Q&A in the comments as well. So if you come along, if you watch it then as opposed to any other point, then myself and Ivana and probably a couple of other people will be on hand in the comments to answer any questions that you've got while the video is going on. So we'd love to see you at those. If you do want to come along, then just head over to the York Environment Week website. All the details are on there. Yeah, and as one of the co-organisers of York Environment Week, I would just generally encourage you to go and have a look, because there's so many great events, and it's really exciting. And yeah, that's it really. So there's some details there if you want to get in touch with us. Like I say, we'd love to hear from you. That's it. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tom. So yes, as Tom said, do take a look at the rest of the stuff on the York Environment Week website. It's been a bit of a labour of love getting it all to happen, but there's some interesting stuff to come and see. So meanwhile, going back to what we talked about this evening, any questions? There were one or two in the chat box. I just want to kind of pick up really on kind of a general point there, which is about space. The fact that you know, there's an assumption that bigger homes and more space is a good thing, but you've got to heat them then. So the notion there of how you deal with that. So 2 points that jump out of that to me. One is there was a question in there from Andy about the internal wall insulation, or whether people really do notice, and that's a good question. I think it's one of those things that almost like the more you talk about it, the more of a problem it becomes. If you could just kind of quietly bundle people out of the house, do the internal wall insulation, plaster the walls, and then invite them back in, maybe people wouldn't even notice. But the fact that people know they're having kind of 4 inches or 6 inches or whatever removed off the sides of rooms tend to be something that people kick off about. But I don't know what are your thoughts on that? I mean, is that a price that's worth paying? And Andy, any kind of responses you've had back from people who've had internal wall insulation done?
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, great talk tonight. Thanks. I've learnt some things. Yeah, I've been putting internal wall insulation in people's homes for about a decade, and I actually enjoy inviting the customers into the rooms afterwards, and I ask them the question, does your room feel smaller? And I've got to say that every single one has said no. And if it doesn't catch your eye, then it's not a problem. One of the things that, I mean, sometimes a piece of furniture might not fit in an alcove like it used to, but generally speaking, it's only 3 or 4% of the floor area that you look. And of course, it's only the external wall of the room. It's not the internal walls. So in a lot of terrace houses, that's only one wall. So not too big a problem, I'd say.
Oh, thank you. And Jeff Beacon, you put an interesting comment in about the notion of only heating bits of houses which you're actually using. There's more you want to say on that?
Yeah. Well, if you go into Spark, that's pretty open, pretty drafty, or some pancrustation, and you sit down in Spark, they warm you by these overhead heating things, which are terrible, really, in terms of energy. I know. But if you sit down at the longest champagne bar in the world, as they build one of St Pancras' stations, you sit down at the table and a heater comes on underneath the table. Now, these are examples of big, empty, unheatable spaces with local heating. I don't think these particular examples are necessarily very good, but poor people can come home, sit in an armchair, turn a 600-watt radiant heater on, point it at the, and I'm thinking of one particular friend, at the armchair, and be quite warm and watch telly. they don't turn on the 26 kilowatt central heating system because it takes an hour or so to heat the radiators and make the ceiling, the lamps move about on the ceiling. They just do it like that, and I'm living in an almost unheated down floor of a cottage, and I'm speaking from the kitchen because there's the heat from the cooking, and a little blow heater next to me, which is pretty bad normally, and the room I live in, I keep the window, the French window open most of the time, and a little bowl of seed for the robins that come in to eat it. And once I'm in bed with 2 duvets, it's lovely and warm. And when I lived across the road in a big flat, I didn't have electricity for a year, and I got to cope with that by staying out in the pubs late at night, or it was when Waterson's had a coffee bar actually, and then being warm in bed and having the right sort of warm on the couch I slept on, which with a back that keeps you warm as well. So there are ways of living that are much less energy intensive, and I think we ought to look at that for all these, because putting all this insulation in is a very big job, isn't it?
It is a big job. I think it's one of those things, though, where if we do want to, for many people, space is a crucial thing. You've not got too much of it, and so you do need to keep it all usable. But I think the general point about making sure that you have heat where you most need it is a good one. So, for example, in our home here, it's a well-insulated home, and it's nice and airtight, but we still thought a bit about where are we going to want heat most. And so for us, the place that we thought was most important was where do you walk around when you come downstairs first thing in the morning to make your breakfast with no shoes on, or where do your feet end up when you're sitting on the sofa? So this is a thermal image on my from my phone of a bit of our living room floor, and you can see the pattern of electric underfloor heating there. You can also see where the cat's been lying. And further to that, you can actually see the back end of the cat is very hot. So the cat's actually had to get up and have a wander around there because its arse end has actually gone bright yellow on my thermal imaging camera. But that's kind of about providing the extra bit of heat where you want it to give comfort, and then not necessarily having to have the whole of the house at a higher temperature. Or
even the whole of the room.
Even the whole of the room, exactly.
I think we ought to do. I mean, I put another comment in about visiting some people on a barge on the Medway, and these barges, they didn't have. I think they'd taken part of the floor out, or it wasn't there in the first place. There was these big beams, 18 inches, 400 millimeters tall, which stopped the drafts going across the floor, which is part of the big problem. Now, you probably don't want to put 400 millimeter barriers across all your roof, crisscross it with these big barriers. But what about something like those things that hang down from doorways that keep the draft out? What about, can we make them go up a bit? Because it is sweeping along the floor, and as you said, it's the feet that get cold first, or the feet is where you really feel it. That we need a lot more innovation to design the thermal landscape inside the house, because it is quite nice to get up from a warm spot to go to a cool spot for a bit. People like differences, and I am a little bit suspicious of mechanical ventilation. It can be stuffy, and there are reports of people just opening the windows to get a bit of fresh air and losing all the benefit.
Okay, thanks for that, Jeff. Any other questions from anybody, or comments, or Ivana?
I just feel like we do need to say, obviously, it's great if people can really live with the cold and if your body can deal with it, but certainly living sort of in a cold home can really badly affect your health. I think below 18 degrees, you're starting to look at increased risk of heart attack and things like that. It's not good for everyone. My arthritic joints are not happy with it. I really want my home insulated. And the UK has some of the worst and oldest stock in Europe. It's been dubbed the cold man of Europe. It's not good for our health, and it's not good for the buildings either. I think if I remember reading somewhere rightly, if a wall goes below 13 degrees, it's much more likely to start getting condensation on it in winter because the air can't hold the moisture, so it will start getting into your walls. So it's not good for the buildings to be too cold and damp because we're living in them. It's not good for us as people. So upgrading the building fabric, I think, is absolutely crucial, both for people, for the buildings, to reduce carbon. And the only way you can do that is by improving the buildings.
There was a
Sorry, I just
question.
thought that.
No, that's a good point. I mean, there was a question which cropped up in the chat box about building regulations. And I think one of the things to say about building regulations, and this picks up on what Ivana said, is that one of the reasons that we have this terrible building stock is we've always had terrible building regulations. And our building regs have never really kind of pushed to create energy efficient, comfortable buildings. And as a consequence, we've got housing stock which we built, well, I was going to say which we built kind of 10, 20 years ago, which is needing major retrofitting now. We're actually still building stuff now where people are moving in and saying that they can't afford to heat it properly, or that one of the bedrooms is too cold, or that they're noticing drafts they didn't expect to find in a new home. And so my advice on that would be, don't rely on the building regulations, but do look at, get an understanding of your own about what it is that keeps buildings warm and comfortable. Look out for it when you're dealing with your own home. Don't simply assume that if you moved into it 10 years ago and it was newly built shortly before that it's going to be built to a comfortable standard, because it won't necessarily be.
Can I comment on Ivana's answer? Ivana may very well be completely right. However, a few years ago, perhaps a decade ago, I had some conversation with some building research people in Sheffield Hallam. And they were saying, as Ivana said, cold and damp makes you ill. But I could never find out whether it was the cold or it was the damp that was the problem. And I wondered what role dehumidifiers have in this equation, because dehumidifiers warm the air and make it less damp.
I think I can partly answer that in that one of the things that I've read about in recent research papers is the fact that where local authorities are starting to look at improving existing social housing stock. So, for example, schemes in Thamesmead where they've got 1960s housing, which is proving almost uninhabitable because people are getting ill, there's mold growth on the walls, it's generally kind of substandard, is what they're actually doing there is they're putting proper mechanical ventilation into the places before they're even starting to think about insulating them, because it's tending to be the damp that's getting to people. The cold is then causing it to condense out on the walls and cause further problems. But the first problem they're sorting out there is just getting proper ventilation to them, so they've actually got fresh air coming into them. We shouldn't be having to make a choice really in terms of kind of whether to keep people warm or keep people dry, but in that particular instance they're keeping people dry first. I think Ivana's right, there's an awful lot of information out there about the effects that cold and damp have on people, and mold growth is certainly something which we should be really treating as something that does not happen in houses in the UK, and all the time it does. We've got a problem we need to deal with.
But as I've seen, not much research on whether it's cold or damp, and in what proportions. I mean, it would be great to see some research.
If I manage to find anything, I'll make sure that when I do a follow-up email, I put some links into it. I'm conscious of the fact that we've now had an hour. We are up to 8 o'clock. If people have questions, then that'd be brilliant, and we're happy to pick them up. And there are enough people in the room who've got some knowledge. That's great, Simon. So waving hand there. So.
Sorry, first apologies, I managed to miss most of it. Sorry about that. Just to comment on this, I mean, it's not the absolute temperature, it's the loss of heat that's the real bit. And I think that in a way, having you know, the discussion about whether cold or hot house is damp and so on is distracting from what is our real problem. And I mean, if you go to really cold countries, they haven't got the choice, because you couldn't live at that temperature. They have to make the fabric of the building so it just, and this also works for hot and cold. You know, you need to make the building so it doesn't lose its heat, and it doesn't gain heat from the exterior if the exterior is very hot.
Yep. Yeah, good point. Thank you. Any other questions or comments, Andy?
Okay, I saw Rose had a hand up as well, that I'd just like to reply to that. One of the things that you've been talking about so well, Phil, but I'd like to emphasize, is that the thing we're trying to do in retrofit is to create a thermal envelope around your living space, a bit like wrapping your house in a duvet. And at that point, then the whole house stays warm because you're not losing the heat. And that's the ultimate aim. Now, because internal wall, for example, you can do it a room at a time, you could create the room, you know, the room that you'll spend most time in, you insulate that and stop all the drafts, and straight away you've got a space to live in, which really won't need much heating.
Yep, good point. Rose, did you have your, was that well spotted there?
Well, I'm going to ask a really noddy question. You might have already explained this, but it's passed me by. So I've got that ventilation is absolutely vital to stop condensation. I've got that, you know, insulation, whether it's on the walls, the roof, whatever, is a good idea. I can't understand the interaction really between the ventilation and the insulation, because is the ventilation within the house, within the, you know, within the insulation? Is it between the insulation and the outside? Where is it?
Okay. The main thing that happens once you start insulating your home, the thing that will happen alongside that is you'll probably make it more airtight. Because unless you're going to replicate all the gaps which are there, you know, around doors, around edges of floors, all that kind of stuff, which you're clearly not going to do, it's going to become more airtight. So you're naturally going to reduce the amount of if you like, natural ventilation that happens with the wind blows and all the damp air goes out of the house, but you get freezing cold. So as that happens, that's one thing which will have an impact on you then needing more ventilation. So the ventilation is basically about getting warm, moist air from your house out to the outside by the shortest route. So it's basically getting air out of your bathroom, out of your kitchen, out of the spaces where you dry clothes in the house, and getting that moisture out of the house. So part of the reason why, as you do things to the house, that you need to think about ventilation is, as I say, is about the fact you're naturally making more airtight. Another part of that is that if you do start putting insulation, particularly on the inside of walls, you need to make sure that you stop moisture going through that insulation into the walls which are beyond it, which are now going to be colder. Because those walls are colder, that warm, moist air will get out there, cool down in your brickwork, dump moisture into the brickwork, and potentially damage it. So as Ivana says, you know, they're kind of, if walls spend a lot of their time being cold and full of moisture, it's not good, because you'll end up with brickwork falling apart. You'll end up with any timber bits of the house which project into the walls, like floor joists and things like that, getting rotten. So that's another reason why it's worth thinking about ventilation at the same time as making improvements to your house. It's partly about the natural increase in air tightness and you needing to then make sure you're getting fresh air supplied and getting the damp out. And it's partly about the fact that as you add insulation to the house, it means you need to think a bit more about making sure that any moisture that does find its way out is handled properly. And generally that means trying to reduce the amount of moisture finding its way out in the first place. So in terms of what you do about that, the easy way to deal with it is to think about getting proper ventilation to spaces where you know you're creating moisture. So making sure you've got proper extract in kitchen, proper extract in bathrooms and toilets, proper extract where you dry clothes. So straightforward stuff like that will deal with the worst of the problem by getting the moist air out of the house. But it obviously leaves you with the problem that you've got to let fresh air back into the house to replace it. If that's coming in at outside temperatures, that's got to then be warmed up, and so that's going to cost you money to do so. So the nuclear option, if you like, the ultimate way of dealing with that is then to look at mechanical ventilation with heat recovery. So what that does is it takes moist air out of the damp parts of your house. It brings fresh air into the living spaces in the house. It puts those two routes of air next to each other so they pass through a heat exchanger. So the heat goes out of the extracted air and warms the incoming air, and means that you get controlled ventilation there, but without the cost of effectively throwing away that heat and having to replace it on the incoming air. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's really helpful. I couldn't quite understand how you ventilate and don't let all the warm air that you've spent so much money trying to keep in, not letting it back out again.
Ultimately, were you in a situation where you had the choice of that warm, moist air exiting your building through your walls, through the structure and causing damage, or whipping it out through extract fans and throwing it straight into the garden, that's still better than B is still better than A there, but there is a C, which is mechanical ventilation with heat recovery, which then means that you're getting the benefits of the ventilation, but not throwing all that energy away. I mean, we've got mechanical ventilation with heat recovery here, and we've got the temperature outside at the moment is probably about 3 or 4 degrees, something like that. The air that's coming into the house is coming in at about 19.5. So they're very, very effective. They are very energy efficient. I know Jeff says that, and there are certainly cases where poorly installed, poorly designed mechanical ventilation systems in houses, and there are some in York, in quite well-known places that we won't bang on about right now, but there are certainly cases where mechanical ventilation in new buildings is not good and doesn't work well, and people do have to lob the windows open on a regular basis. But mechanical ventilation designed properly, so sized properly, installed properly, and where people understand how the controls work for it, should be pretty much fit and forget, and should be something where, all we have to do is, check the filters twice a year, give them a hoover a couple of times, and then change them once a year. And it looks after itself, and the amount of energy it uses is negligible in comparison with the amount of energy it saves us.
This is a question, not an assertion, but do dehumidifiers have any role at all?
I don't know about that one, but Andy's shaking his head vigorously. So, Andy.
Nah.
He says.
Nah, we don't want dehumidifiers. Look, Britain lives in a state of being relative humidity between 60 and 80%. You could put a dehumidifier in a field and you'd fill it with water every day. No, the trick, as Phil has quite rightly said, is to be aware of where the moisture is coming from. I mean, I go around so many houses and every radiator is full of socks and pants. And they go, do you know, we've got so much condensation in this house, we can't think where it's coming from. And it's coming from people drying clothes. So no, and anyway, dehumidifiers use energy, so it's much better to use passive ways to get rid of it all. I'd just like to add something to what you said, Phil, about mechanical ventilation with heat recovery, MVHR. Every passive house has an MVHR system designed into it, the standard. Putting MVHR, a whole house unit, a whole house MVHR into an existing house is really quite tricky. And the reason for that is it's finding the places to put the ducts. Now, I've been in your house, Phil. It's a great example. It's a national case study. Great piece of work you've done there. And, in some places you can see the boxed in ducting running between rooms, and that's just a feature. There is an alternative. There is something that's worked quite well for quite a number of my customers. And this is where you focus on the rooms that have got moisture. And as you rightly say, it's the kitchens, the bathrooms, the utility rooms. And what you can consider doing is putting an individual room MVHR unit into those rooms and put an automatic door closer on those rooms. And then you're managing the moisture burden in the house to those smaller spaces. And in the other parts of the house, I have found that simply using trickle vents on windows, or even just having the window slightly open, like on the security setting, the security latch, is sufficient. And because if you've insulated it massively, as Phil has done, and other people on this call have done, then the room doesn't cool down. It doesn't obviate the value of the insulation. You can get fresh air in, but the room doesn't drop to freezing. I did this in my house, and that was my experience.
That's a good point. Many thanks for that, Andy.
Can I just say that although dehumidifiers do use energy, they recover enormous amounts of energy from the latent heat of condensation. And I'm not saying Andy's wrong in a practical sense, but I've yet, I'd like to see more research done to take the humidity out of the air and turn it into heat.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Any other questions or points of view on Dee?
Yes, about 20 years ago, someone said to me, oh, when you have fresh air come into your house, fresh air actually heats up more quickly, more efficiently than stale air. And I've always believed that. And I'm just curious if the science kind of supports that, or if that was just something that someone had said. Because I love fresh air. I have my door or window open all the time. And I have little places where I keep heated where necessary. And so I've always kind of said it, repeated it, and I'm not sure if it's correct to repeat it scientifically.
That's an interesting one. Andy was shaking his head pretty vigorously again there. So I think, obviously fresh air into your house is a good thing from the point of view of making the space more pleasant. But in terms of the science of whether that air has any different kind of moisture content, is therefore any more difficult to heat up or easier to heat up, I doubt it. Yeah, there's a lot of wrinkling of brows, and I think, yeah, no, Tom's just smiling, which is always a good sign. So he clearly thinks it's up for questioning. So no, I think have the fresh air for the joy of the fresh air, but don't assume it's going to be easier to heat up. Ivana's got a point there. So
I'll pose the question to Thomas as a climate, scientist. He's atmospheric chemist. So yeah,
he's the
I'll
man we
ask
need.
him.
Cool. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Just a question for you, Dee. I mean, you're over the other side of the Atlantic. Kind of do some of the issues that we've got over here kind of ring true for what people are thinking over there in terms of what you're doing to your homes?
Absolutely. It's actually incredibly relevant. And it's interesting because the city of Vancouver just very recently passed the CEAP, Climate Emergency Action Plan. It's a 371-page report that the city council asked their staff to create about a year ago. And it just finally came out to everyone, and they had to basically vote on whether or not they were going to adopt it. And within this 371 pages, the two main areas that needed the most improvement were almost half was vehicle emissions, and the other half was homes and the substances behind heating and all the energy used there. So anything to do with carbon emissions, it was looking like 40% vehicles, 40% home building. So it's extremely relevant over here as well.
And is the situation over there that, with a fair proportion of housing stock in private ownership, so therefore the kind of improvements that need to be made very much rely upon individuals looking at their own homes, working out where to spend money on them, trying to find how they get the money to spend on it, and then taking action?
Yes, and with more attention now being drawn to passive house, because I had never heard of a passive house design before, just even in this past year, and especially during COVID, everyone's talking about this type of design now, and just harnessing energy or reusing energy somehow or reformatting it. It's actually, I find it quite exciting, and instead of now that we've gotten to the point where we have acknowledged that there are issues globally, climate-wise, now past the acknowledgement and the education of it, well, let's continue the education of it, it's great, but now it's time for the action, and this is giving people solutions, giving people ideas of how to actually take care of it right in your own home, because and I think that is so great, because it takes off a lot of the stress, because you can tell everyone the sky is falling, but we could actually solve it. We have there are so many different things, and humans are so smart and so resourceful. I find it very hopeful, very optimistic, and extremely exciting. So that's why I like to hear it from the ground up, the different ideas that everybody has, and I love it. I love seeing Ivana at the St. Nick's place. I love all that. And then, you know, you've got all of these individuals who want to walk the talk, like you were saying, that other person who is a climate scientist and very interested in actually living it. I find it great.
Excellent.
And very relevant.
Andy, you were waving your finger around in front of your nose there in a meaningful way. So,
absolutely, yes. I'd very much like to commend what York Community Energy are doing in terms of helping people work out what the priorities are in their own home. And there is this concept of creating a whole house plan, and that's done in as a discussion between the homeowners and people who understand about energy and insulation and ventilation and drafts and so on. Because here's the thing, you could have 10 identical houses, but each one would have different priorities because of the way they're used. Like the first house could have a young family with young kids. The second family, it's an elderly couple that don't, you know, stay in one room mostly. The next house is a young couple that are only there evenings and weekends and so on. And so working out those priorities is a really good start, because here's the thing, you don't have to do it all at once. If you focus your energy, literally your personal energy on retrofitting to a plan, then you're going to get the most benefit sooner.
yeah, I think there's an interesting point out. So thanks for raising that, about the fact that our houses are not simply bricks and mortar, but they are the lives that we live within them. And to some extent, there's an element of kind of walking the walk, which I should do, which is that one of the things I bang on about a lot is getting people to do a good brief, telling you what they want to be able to do in places. And one of the things I do often with doing design work with people is to ask them to write a day in their life, or a day in how they would like their life to be when whatever it is that they're having done has been completed. And so maybe that's something that we should be doing as part of any work we do to buildings, to make sure that we're not simply making assumptions about the way they're going to be used. And this kind of touches back on the points that Jeff's made about kind of how you kind of do your responses according to the way you want to be able to live there, or in the house, or down the pub, or wherever else, and how, you know, different types of families, different types of households will have different priorities. I think with one of the scary things about looking at the figures that I've seen, certainly, and I'm sure we've all seen this kind of stuff, is how much we are going to have to do if we are really going to be serious about making a kind of change to the impact we're having on climate. If we really do want the future to be in any way salvageable. So being able to target the stuff we're doing so that we do feel that we're getting something back from it in those early stages will be a key to persuading people that it's worth doing at all. So I think that's a very kind of good thing to be reminded of. So thank you for that. Anything else, folks, while you are all here? And before nope, that's brilliant. Well, thank you very much for all coming and spending the evening with us. I'll repeat what Ivana and Tom have both said. Do take a look at the yorkenvironmentweek.org.uk. I think that's right, Tom, isn't it? Website. And there are plenty of other events on this week. I'll do a naked and unashamed plug to one that I'm doing tomorrow evening, which is looking at how housing design has moved on since the 2013 Housing Awards, where we brought the display panels up to York back in 2014. I've got two of the architects who won awards in 2013 talking about work they've done since then and how housing design has moved on since then. Both of them are doing and have done other stuff in York, so there's very much a local angle on that. So there's still a chance to book for that, because the joy of online events is we can just keep printing tickets until we've got enough for everybody who wants to attend. So do turn up for that if you're interested. Many thanks once again, and we will make sure that the recording for this goes up onto a YouTube channel. I will make sure there's a follow-up email to all of you which picks up on any links which have been put into the chat box during the course of the evening. And if there's anything which I can root out on some of the other slightly knottier questions which we've had, I'll make sure that goes up there too. So many thanks, folks. Hope you had a good evening. I hope you have warm homes to retire into. And if you don't have warm homes, I hope you have alcohol. So take care.